Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am Destructicon and today it is my pleasure to bring you my review and analysis of Conan Unconquered. In this video I shall be comparing Conan with its closest counterpart that I've played, list some of the new features which the game brings, and finally rate it on its execution and ultimately how fun it is. Now, let's dive into it. Conan Unconquered is an RTS survival game by developer Petroglyph and publisher Funcom. In case you aren't familiar with them, Petroglyph have created the very fun and successful Star Wars RTS Empire at War and its expansion, Forces of Corruption, and it's refreshing to see the developer back with another take on the genre. In terms of RTS survival games, the most similar one to compare Conan to is They Are Billions, an indie game with a similar premise where your goal is to hold on against ludicrous numbers of living dead. Petroglyph take the essence of this concept and you'll find many familiar elements, such as the city building aspect, a focus on constant expansion, fortification design, in-combat pause, and a wave system constantly throwing enemies at you. The main difference comes from the zombies, or lack thereof. Yes, it might not sound like much of a difference, but when the enemy is very much alive and in possession of enough mental acuity to, say, use ranged weapons, well, that can be a game changer. Ranged units have the nasty advantage of being able to focus fire a certain section of your defense and breach them, in a way even a massed horde of zombies couldn't. And being alive, the enemy will continuously find new and delightful surprises to throw at you. You have the choice of playing Conan in either its brief but surprisingly challenging campaign or Unconquered mode, which I shall get into later. The campaign of Conan acts very much like a tutorial, gradually introducing you to new enemy types and mechanics. This is one campaign I strongly recommend going through, as the enemies have quite a lot of nasty aces up their sleeves. As mentioned earlier, the city building aspect should be somewhat familiar to veterans of similar games. The backbone of your economy will be your thralls, which provide your empire with manpower and vital taxes. To support your thralls, you'll need food, and to expand your realm with more buildings, you also need command. But in order to grow, you also need to manage the harvesting of several construction and secondary resources, such as lumber, stone, iron, star metal, animals, and souls. One slight deviation from They Are Billions are the resource squares you'll see on the map. These squares will determine how efficient a gathering building is by how many it can cover. I find this visual cue to be a more refined take on the resource gathering system, as it allows you to more easily min-max the architecture of your base. It also helps that the structures in Conan are smaller overall, making base building slightly easier and somewhat counterbalancing the Tetris nature of it. One more early game difference you'll notice is the hero. Yes, instead of starting the game with a small contingent of units, you'll instead either command the legendary Conan, the pirate Valyria, or a third hero which I haven't yet unlocked. Conan is more AoE oriented, with each of his blows doing some cleave damage, while Valyria is more single target focused, not doing any AoE on her auto attacks. Each also gets an ultimate on level 2 and continue gaining damage and HP as they level up. The heroes, combined with the lack of zombies wanting to get into your base and nom nom your precious thralls, will encourage you to go out and explore, in an early game that is more reminiscent of Warcraft 3. Occasionally, you'll encounter enemy camps in the form of bandits or giant creepy crawlies like spiders or scorpions. Slaying these and destroying their camp will reward you with some resources, which you'll very much want to gather, as they greatly help accelerate your base building. There are also certain boss enemies on the map which you'll very much want to slay, as they drop some powerful items, but these I found to be more oriented towards the late game. As hinted at earlier, the enemies will start to come at you in waves. You can track these via a status bar at the top of your screen to see how long you have until the next wave hits, as well as the enemy composition. An icon will also be displayed on the minimap to show where the attack will hit from. Unlike They Are Billions though, these waves will start hitting much earlier. And not only do they hit earlier and more frequently, but the number of surprises the enemy will bring to bear is truly horrifying. You'll face bats and spiders of various sizes, which have a particularly nasty tendency of bypassing otherwise unpassable terrain and going to town on your buildings. At a later point, you'll encounter fire throwers, and discover that your structures are a lot more flammable than you'd like. Building in deserts tends to do that. Fortunately, Fortunately, any of your troops can put out fires, even your hero. Oh, how glorious. But while putting out fires, your troops will be tied down, unable to retaliate. Even later on, you'll discover that necromancers are a thing, and they really like raising skeletons as meat shields. In addition, all those corpses lying around can also cause some nasty diseases, doing damage and crippling the movement speed of your units. And last, but certainly not least, you'll find that the desert dwellers have also learned the particularly nasty art of siege warfare. And as you can imagine, siege engines and bases don't really go well together. Oh, and even the environment is out to kill you, with certain waves being obscured by massive sandstorms, which not only hide the size, direction and composition of the attacking force, but also blur your minimap, making it harder to manage your defenses. While all this does sound overwhelming, I found that the pacing of the game is actually quite fair. After some trial and error, you should be able to raise an appropriate response to each threat. Not quite fast enough as to get too comfortable, but not quite late enough as to be broken. To handle all the new waves of nasties being hurled at you, Conan also puts at your disposal a pretty big roster of units. The units are broken down into 3 major categories: ranged, melee, and cavalry, with ranged countering melee units, melee countering cav, and cav countering ranged. At a later point, you'll also be able to field sorcerers to provide some AoE damage, and priestesses to heal your army. Unfortunately, your troops do come with a downside. They require food and a constant upkeep of gold to maintain. In addition, the diversity of troops needed to counter all threats will result in you requiring a pretty big army in the end. As such, to hold the tides of enemies, you'll also need fortifications in the forms of various walls and towers, but these also have some weaknesses of their own. While pretty solid early on, your walls feel a lot more vulnerable in the late game, and the old tactics of double stacking will not hold in the face of massed splash damage or fire. To make the most out of your fortifications, you'll want to build them in choke points, not only so that you can funnel as many enemies as possible into your AoE meat grinder, but so that you can also manage the building and upkeep costs. Of course, if all this sounded pretty complicated till now, remember that you don't have access to all of your troops or infrastructure right off the bat and must research them first. Research is done in various guild buildings, which further eat away at your economy due to upkeep costs, and it also forces you to plan and assess how you want to develop your empire. As such, from what I've gathered in my playthroughs, the best and most optimal way to play Conan is as greedy as bloody possible. You want to delay training troops for as long as possible, as their upkeep costs will eat away into your expansion, relying on your hero to handle early threats. You also want to delay building fortifications so you can pump all available early gold into erecting as many houses as possible, which will in turn generate more gold and allow you to build even more houses. And even when you do start building fortifications and fielding troops, you only want the bare minimum necessary to defend while you continue expanding your economy and doing research. Kind of like a modern corporation. And if all this sounds risky, well, that's because it is. Your entire success constantly balances on a knife's edge. If you didn't take enough risks early and then expand your economy, you can't possibly have enough to survive the later waves. However, if you've gambled just a tiny bit too much, you can easily get overwhelmed on a particularly nasty late wave. And even if you do survive, you could have taken so much damage as to be hopelessly behind and not able to hold off the next one. However, you do have a few ways in which you can customize your experience, especially in Unconquered mode, and overall the list of options is a bit larger than they are billions. Through a system of sliders, you can influence the unit density of the map, how open or narrow the various chokes will be, the resource density and number of waves. A few of the options, such as Infinite Wave Mode, will be unlocked after completing certain milestones, giving you something to strive towards. There are also 4 bonus effects, which you can either enable or disable, such as Elite Creeps, which will litter the map with stronger versions of monsters you can encounter, or Crom Mode, which disables the Soft Pause, the one allowing you to still issue commands and build stuff while freezing time, giving you a more authentic RTS experience and significantly hardening the game. A cool new feature is the ability to save a map you've played as a challenge. Doing so allows you to replay the map at a later point or to share it, allowing your friends or the entire online community to partake in the gem you might have discovered. The graphics of the game lean more towards fidelity rather than style, and while they aren't spectacular, they do get the job done and are up to today's standards. The units and building models and textures are clear enough to distinguish from the different types. The UI is clean and will provide all the information you need, and the special effects such as day-night or fire and sandstorm are well done. The sounds are also not very special. They do the job, but don't really capture any sense of impact. You have the usual combat noises, along with an assortment of clicks and clanks from your buildings and a context-sensitive background musical score. The heroes are probably the most satisfying, especially Conan, with his cleaves sounding appropriately brutal and his demeanor being serious and gruff.
They were weak, if I must. Very well. To battle!
In stark contrast, the units sound like... well, I'll let you decide.
Training complete.
While Conan does RTS survival, and does it well, it's also fair to point out that it still lacks a bit in the way of variety, with only one game mode, which you can albeit play in several customizable ways, including co-op. However, the devs do recognize this and priced it at only half a AAA rate. And with no further monetization attached to it, I find this price per value to be more than fair. Overall, I found Conan to be a very enjoyable game. The constant need to balance economy and defense, the wave-to-wave assessment of exactly what kind of troop you need, and the hectic nature of jumping from screen to screen to crush your enemy, see him driven before you while hearing the lamentation of his javelins, earns Conan an 8 out of 10. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you stuck with me till the end, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing and commenting. I do my best to produce content regularly, so you can tune in next week for a new video. You can also find me streaming on twitch.tv/Destructicon, and also find some of my work on TL.net where I cover StarCraft 2. Thank you all for watching and have an awesome day!